darling, isn't it? Soak it in, feel the strings, hear the sound of angels' wings. This is heaven's music, fit for kings.
The Russian plays on and on, like an endless telethon. How I wish that he were Elton John.
Charles likes clever girls.
All right, I'm no intellect, but maybe there's a discotheque where the prince could hear some Prince and we'd all get funkadelic. Then again, don't create a scene. You're auditioning to be his queen, and if Queen were playing now, Freddie Mercury would slay it.
This is how your people, this is how your people dance.
Take a voice, come on, let's some noise.
This is how your people, this is how your people dance.
Raven Wren, give it up for Adam Ant.
Where are you, Diana?
Huh?
You seem a million miles away.
The music is transporting me. I guess it's the royal drill to smile a lot and sit still, though I don't know why she's here, and I'd really like to sock her. And then there's Charles, who's happy when he hears music by dead white men. Perhaps his girl could turn him into a rocker.
This is how your people, this is how your people dance.
Young and free, everything you wanna be.
This is how your people, this is how your
Perhaps this girl can turn him into a rocker.
young and free, everything you wanna be. Feel the groove, even royals need to move. This is how your people, this is how your people, this is how your happy, glad, body people dance.
Hello, I'm Gina Duvall, and this season I have the honor of playing Princess Diana in Diana the Musical on Broadway. You just watched one of our opening numbers, which takes to the stage this November 2nd and premieres on Netflix October 1st. Diana's extraordinary life has been inspirational to me, and I know it has been inspirational to millions of people from around the world. Her legacy of kindness will live forever.
Appearing today, EPA Administrator Michael S. Regan, Senator Ben Sass, Christian Serrano, Lisa Ling, Eva Chen, and Lauren Groff. Thank you to our Atlantic Festival underwriters on the founding level, Facebook. On the presenting level, Boston Consulting Group, EY, Genentech, Southern Company, Walton Family Foundation. On the supporting level, Allstate, U.S. Bank. On the contributing level, American Federation of Teachers, Barclays, the Janssen Pharmaceutical Companies of Johnson & Johnson, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, PayPal, Salesforce.org, and Truth Initiative. And now, here's the weather and feature anchor of the Today Show and co-host of the third hour of Today, Al Roker.
Climate change is as urgent as ever. We're seeing warmer temperatures, more hurricanes, wildfires, and flooding. Scientists and environmentalists have been sounding alarms for many years. Now, is the changing climate finally palpable enough for our general population and climate change deniers to take it more seriously? Can we slow global warming down before it's too late? Well, joining us now is the administrator of the EPA, Michael S. Regan. Michael, good to see you.
It's good to see you as well.
And before we start, just a technical note here. We're in these chairs that if you move, they make the sound of methane escaping. So we just want people to know it's not us. All right, so, but thanks so much for being here. We really appreciate it. And just last week, UN General Assembly met. Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, "We are on the verge of the abyss and we cannot afford to step in the wrong direction." So, to your mind, what were the biggest takeaways on climate change policy coming out of the General Assembly?
You know, I think the biggest change is really nothing that we haven't been listening to for quite some time. I think there's a bigger commitment on the international stage, with America being one of these countries that's taking it very serious. The president had it right. This is a code red climate moment. And I think on that UN stage, you saw a number of countries banding together, really digesting and embracing the science and committing, putting serious commitments on the table to combat climate change.
But how do we make sure countries, including our own, follow up on those commitments?
You know, I think with the UN coming together and putting these commitments in place, that's the first step. I think all of the countries have to put regulations, policies, tax incentives, investments in place. That's what we need to see happening globally, and that's what you're seeing with President Biden's Build Back Better agenda. It's really not just a slogan. It's a shot in the arm in terms of how we can invest in this country, combat climate change, create millions of jobs, but make this country globally competitive.
Speaking globally, you know, we got the opening of COP26, the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. It's just a month away. Do you see building on what came out of the UN General Assembly happening at COP26?
Absolutely. I think what you'll see are serious commitments from countries all around the globe, including the United States, making significant declarations on what we're committed to do to combat climate change, from regulations and policies and commitments, all the way to real significant investments in infrastructure, environmental justice and equity, and the assurance that we are looking at economic incentives to make this country competitive, but also to combat it on the global stage.
And you talk about the global stage, you know, given the previous 4 years, there had been a pullback from our commitments to climate change. How do you silence those critics who say, well, you know, that happened. How do we know that that's not going to happen again?
You know, what's different about this go around are the significant investments that we're seeing at the national level, not just from the government, but we're seeing our private sector really put the money where their mouth is. We're seeing asset managers and others really advocating for the markets driving in this direction. We see advanced technologies that are coming online that can't be refuted. So what's happening is a rowing in the same direction from multiple industries across multiple sectors, as well as the government. You're seeing a holistic approach that's not just being driven by government and regulations, but by markets, technologies, and new business models.
I was going to ask, you know, you have governments who have to put in policy, put in regulation, but you also have to have buy-in from the private sector. Does the private sector now, from what you've seen, not only want to do good, but realize that that really does affect their bottom line?
Absolutely. It really is about the bottom line. It's also about their ability to recruit and retain a new workforce. I mean, the reality is sustainability, climate change, reducing pollutants. This is all part of the common vernacular, especially of our youth. And so companies are evolving, looking at their bottom lines, but looking at how they can be relevant and be competitive moving forward.
Because now consumers are actually holding them responsible for being good corporate citizens of the planet.
Absolutely. The market is really the rallying cry. And I think what the president is really grabbed onto, not only is the market the rallying cry, but when I travel the country, overwhelmingly, we see support for the types of investments that he's advocating for to protect our planet, to invest in our infrastructure, but just as important, to create jobs. There are millions of jobs associated with this new clean energy economy, and I think people are on board.
When you talk about that, you know, there are going to be communities and areas where older technologies, older jobs that are based more on carbon-based economies, those jobs are going to be going away. How do you go into those communities and say, we're going to transition to these new cleaner energy jobs and make sure that folks can take part in that new economy?
You know, some of that requires education and retraining, but the good news is a lot of these skills are transferable to the new clean economy. Many of the folks that have the skill sets in carpentry, electricians, general contractors, accountants, engineers, these are all transferable disciplines and skills. So we anticipate that there will be an opportunity for lots of people to participate in what we're seeing as the new future. In the meanwhile, there will be certain trades and certain communities that we will have to help transition. But the plan is to look at how we can use this moment as a rising tide for all communities and not leave anyone behind.
This is also a time where, at the EPA, environmental justice and trying to correct some inequalities when it comes to communities of color who have been obviously more impacted by air pollution, a lack of water quality. That is now a priority.
It is. It should have been a priority long before now, but the president pledged that racial justice and environmental justice will be center to this administration. EPA has made that a priority, and to your point, we have seen the disproportionate impact of pollution on many of our communities of color and our tribal communities, and now climate change is just compounding that, it's exacerbating that. So we have an obligation to provide equal protection from pollution to all communities, and this is the moment.
And air quality is one of those big drivers of that inequality. At the EPA, what are you folks doing to try to correct those problems?
You know, from the very beginning, I've requested that all of my staff look at their program implementation through the lens of environmental justice and equity. What that means is every policy, every regulation, every contract, all procurement will be done through the lens of environmental justice. We're also ramping up our enforcement. There are laws on the books that should protect all communities. We have to do a better job of enforcing those laws. There's no secret here that many communities, many of our vulnerable communities, are seeing disproportionate impacts of pollution, which exacerbates asthma. We're seeing higher incidences of lung disease and heart disease. This is because of exposure. It's our obligation to think through how we protect our most vulnerable.
Is there any one policy that comes to mind that's going to help address that in the short term?
You know, it's not one policy. It's a whole of government approach. And at EPA, what we're doing is we're looking across all of our offices, from outreach and education to our water and our air offices and our land management offices. We've seen water pollution that disproportionately impacts our vulnerable communities, air pollution, brownfields and Superfund sites that have been left abandoned in our communities, where we have an opportunity to clean up that legacy pollution, that old abandoned gas station, and really turn that part of the community into a thriving economic development opportunity. So it's an all of the above approach, and it's going to take that.
2021 has been a year of weather extremes. Seems like, much like for folks in the pandemic, when we were looking for 2021 to be a reset from 2020, well, it's been the same way weather-wise, you know, just all these extremes, fires, floods, hurricanes. There are those who look at this, and we know climate is something that you look at over the long term, but have you looked at this and almost scratch your head? Could we be at a tipping point that you know, we've seen a number of these events now happening over a short span of time, and that could we be looking at a tipping point at this juncture?
We are looking at a tipping point. We're close to the edge. But what I find as I travel the country, people, some are listening to the scientists, some are listening to the meteorologists like yourself who have been talking about this issue for a long period of time. Some are listening to our national security advisors. But most are looking at what they're seeing and what they're feeling.
In their own communities.
In their own communities. Wildfires ravaging the West, droughts, floods in the middle of the country, storms like Hurricane Ida ravaging the Gulf Coast, landing in New York and New Jersey. This is not a far-fetched idea anymore. This isn't something that you have to have a science degree to understand. People are looking outside of their windows and seeing what's happening right in front of their very eyes. And so I think that there is much more of an awareness now, which is going to make it easier for us to connect with our communities with bold solutions. We have to ensure that the conversations that are happening all across the country permeate the gridlock that we're seeing in Washington, D.C.
I was just going to say, it seems to me, anecdotally, when I've traveled covering these stories, that the average American citizen knows this is happening. They see this is happening. It affects them. It affects their neighbors. That they are at a point of acceptance of this in far greater numbers than their elected officials. Do you think that they need to help their elected officials come along board?
They're absolutely going to have to apply pressure to those who represent them so that those who represent them are actually representing their best interests. We know we have an aging infrastructure. We know that we need to repair our water infrastructure just to get the basics around good quality drinking water. Some of that is because the infrastructure is aging. Some of that is because it's being pounded by extreme weather. And so people are really seeing it at the very basic level. And I think that they will have to apply more pressure to their elected officials so that we can get the investments that we need. Again, this is about an opportunity to put regular people to work repairing a failing infrastructure, making it more resilient to climate change while earning a good paycheck. This is common sense, and these are the types of investments we need to see all across the country.
When you look at the investments we need to make, and we're just one country, granted a large part of that issue, but what about the bigger countries having to help the smaller developing countries that are probably having greater issues, in a sense, proportionately, as far as, you know, creating cleaner energy, better conditions, and those sort of things? Because now we've got to take care of ourselves, but we have to take care of or help along these other countries.
We do, and I think the president's message to the UN was we're all in this together. And I think there was a commitment there by the president that the developed nations need to invest more in some of the undeveloped countries because they're, you know, bearing the biggest brunt around climate change. But this is an opportunity for America to lead, which is what the president's doing. This really is about leadership. Many of the solutions that we have at our fingertips that we need to see play out will play out if Congress approves the resources that we need to get that shot in the arm. And so this is a significant opportunity for America to continue to lead, step out on that international stage, and pull the rest of the world along with us.
As you look at what's on your desk, as you move through 2021 and look ahead towards 2022, what do you have coming up that you're really excited about?
You know, I'm excited about our climate change agenda. Just last week, we announced a rule that phases down hydrofluorocarbons, many times more potent than carbon dioxide. We're going to reduce HFCs by 85% over the next 15 years. We proposed a rule to look at tailpipe emissions, which will usher our auto industry closer to, electric vehicles. We're going to propose a rule in the coming weeks that looks at reducing methane from our oil and gas sector. And we're going to round that out by looking at reducing pollution from our power plants. All of these, in a cumulative fashion, will put us on the right trajectory to be successful in reducing these climate pollutants. But I'm really excited about doing that along with our traditional mission of protecting people from air quality pollutants as well as water quality pollutants, and doing it through the lens of environmental justice and equity. This is an opportunity right now for EPA to use this as a rising tide for all communities, and the moment is now.
You know, we were just out, my producer and I, we were just out in California, and they had this mobile van that was registered, that would measure, any kind of pollutants that were coming off of us personally or out of homes. That while we know that they're the usual suspects of auto emissions, aircraft emissions, things like that, but that the regular products we use in our home, whether it's deodorants, hair shampoos, well, I don't use shampoo that much, but all those things that give off fragrances are an issue, and that California is working to try to, with manufacturers, to bring those use more plant-based systems to bring about a lessening of those air pollutants that we have in our homes that we don't even think about. Is that something that's on the docket for the EPA on a national level?
I think we're focused on the biggest emitters of pollution. I think we all have some personal responsibility to reduce our carbon footprint. And we're seeing many companies develop products, as you've described, that reduces that pollution through the supply chain. But right now, the EPA is focused on the biggest polluters, the HFCs, the methane, the carbon from the coal plants. These are the opportune targets for us to really channel our energy, put the right rules of engagement in place so that we get meaningful reductions if we're going to meet our climate goals.
You talk about the president's toolbox, things that he can do outside of Congress to affect these changes. But as we've seen, unless these are kind of baked into our laws, they can be rolled back with the stroke of a pen. How do we make it that these are more baked into our legal DNA to protect the environment?
The good news is we've seen over the past couple of administrations efforts to move forward and move back. The courts have weighed in. We have a much better competitive advantage right now to think about how we move forward with durable rules. So there have been some things that have been tried that have been less successful. We've also seen some things that have been very successful. It's our turn now to apply those lessons of the past to create a durable solution moving forward. But the trick this time is to marry these regulatory objectives with the power of the markets and the evolution of technology. Coupled together, it will create a momentum that will not be easily reversed.
What do you say to folks who say, this is so big, I feel helpless? What hope do you give them?
Within this crisis, there are significant opportunities. I mean, this is not a problem that's too big for this country or the world. We just have to roll up our sleeves and get to work. So what I would say in an optimistic fashion is if we can all row in the same direction, here's a significant opportunity to reduce pollution, make the quality of life better for everyone, and have good paying jobs associated with this transition. This is really an opportunity.
You've got a young son. I've got teenagers and 20-somethings. And we've seen in this last year this youth movement rise up again. I mean, it seems every generation has this drive to affect change, and it seems that this environmental change is really being driven right now by young people. How is that impacting your policy?
Oh, significantly. As we know, when we look back at history, most big social movements are led by young people, which is why I've opened my doors and have been in communication with lots of young people who are tired of the gridlock and the excuses. They know that they will inherit this planet, which is why the president's Build Back Better agenda is much more than a slogan. It's a real shot in the arm to make the investments we need to deliver the type of protection to take care of the planet the way we need for our young people.
You speak about young people. There was a new study just out of journal Science. Climate change is going to bring 3 times as many climate disasters to today's 6-year-olds as opposed to their grandparents who were, say, born in 1960. Twice as many wildfires, almost twice as many tropical cyclones, 3.5 times more river floods. You know, it would seem that we are running out of time. How quickly do we need to act from a governmental standpoint, not just for us, but globally, before we can, if not reverse this, certainly slow it down?
We need to act now. I think we all have a major sense of urgency, which is why the president has this whole of government approach. I mean, we truly need to act right now. We need the investments that the president's asking for in climate mitigation to curtail the pollution we're seeing. Some of these things that you've laid out, we're going to be living with for the foreseeable future. So we need to invest in our current infrastructure so that it can be more resilient as well.
Do we have to wrap our heads around the idea that our way of life is changing, and that we can do what we need to do, but a lot of this is going to be about adaptation?
Absolutely. We do have to adapt to a changing environment. I think that is probably not going to be as difficult as we might think. I mean, to be honest, there are advanced technologies and ways to make life more efficient and simple that we're already evolving and adapting to. But yes, some of the changing weather patterns, looking at the different temperatures in different parts of the country, less water availability, humanity is resilient by nature. These adaptive practices that we can put in place can be done in a way where it actually minimalizes the impact that we're seeing on a daily basis. And we talk about our children. As we think about the younger generation moving forward, many of these changes that we're having to make, they're unaware of. So this will be part of the new norm for them.
In wrapping this up, how are you optimistic that we can, if not stop these changes, that we can slow them down enough so that we buy ourselves more time as we catch up technically?
I'm very optimistic. I think the science and the data proves that if we act now with a sense of urgency, that we can slow global warming down and that we can adapt to what we're considering to be a new normal. We can adapt to this. We can thrive in this. It's just that we need to act now.
Well, Michael Reagan, I know that you've got a lot on your plate going on right now, and I think part of the problem is I think people are almost exhausted because there's a certain amount of pessimism about this, and it's good to hear that there is some optimism. So we really appreciate you taking the time and talking with us about this.
Well, thank you.
All right, always good to see you. And if you noticed, we didn't hear that much from the chairs, so that worked out pretty nicely. Good to see you, sir.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
Here's the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us at the Atlantic Festival. I hope you've enjoyed what you've seen so far. We have even more for you. And right now, I'm going to be speaking with Senator Ben Sasse, Republican of Nebraska. Thank you for joining us at the Digital Atlantic Festival on our fancy set.
Thank you. I
Yeah.
wish we were at an actual embodied festival.
One
but
day,
good to be with you.
One day there'll be a live audience in front of you. It'll be shocking, but we'll have you next year. I hope by then we'll be able to be back. We'll be able to be back live. So let's just talk about American politics and the mood in the country. What's wrong with American politics? And don't take the full 25 minutes to answer that question. Try to answer that in a minute.
Premature elaboration.
And then we'll go from there. But let's talk about but lift all the way up and describe for us from your perspective as obviously a Republican, Midwest heartland, but somebody who has veered in some fairly dramatic ways from what I would call, you don't have to call it this, but I would call the Trumpian norm or the new Trumpian norm. Give us a little bit of a diagnosis from where you sit.
Well, you said pull all the way up, so I think that means we have to pull up above politics a little bit, and I think that is that we're living through a digital revolution. I'm a historian by training, and I think 100 years from now, when you look back on this moment, people aren't going to talk very much about Donald Trump or about politics more generally. I think they're going to talk about the fact that we're living through one of the most transformative times in the history of technology and therefore economics and culture. Usually a historian's job is to sort of trace change, continuity versus discontinuity over time, and usually it's a pretty boring job because people always think they live at an inflection point in human history, and really there's usually a lot more continuity than discontinuity. We just think there's radical change because humans are narcissists and we're at that moment. But I think retrospectively we are going to think the change from an economy that's mostly about atoms to mostly about bits and how that transforms work is the thing that's happening in our time and place. So I think we're being unsettled from community. We're the first people in human history that are really going to see the end of lifelong work. We're going to have adolescent-like experiences in terms of identity crises for 40, 45, and 50-year-olds as you have to figure out what you're going to do for the rest of your life because the jobs you worked in were eaten by software. And I think that unsettling of community in place raises lots of fundamental questions about what gives people happiness and meaning and connection and neighborliness. And so I think almost everything that's happening in our politics is downstream from that.
Can you describe the manifestations of, I would call it the cognitive revolution, but you can call it whatever you want. The globalized linking of every human. I mean, and maybe talk about it specifically in terms of one tech company to keep it from floating off into total abstraction. The theory of Facebook was that it would be good to connect all human beings simultaneously and in real time and instantly. There were some people who thought maybe human beings shouldn't be talking to all other human beings all the time. Maybe there's a downside to that. But can you talk about what you've noticed, the change, the kind of change that's been brought about by the social media revolution in particular?
Maybe, but I'm not sure I'll be great at it.
You're saying no comment to that?
No, I'm not. Not no comment, but I wish Neil Postman were alive because I think one of the great things that you find in technology critics and media critics in the past is that they were good at saying whenever there's a change, there's both cost and benefit to this thing, and we tend to want to be utopian or dystopian about all of it. This new technology is going to make everything new. It's going to usher in the eschaton, or the world's going to end tomorrow because of this new thing. And usually it's some of both. And I think just at the level of what new technology brings us economically, we are the richest people in all of human history at a consumer level. We get more high-quality, cheap stuff than any median middle-class society has ever been able to consume in history. There's a lot of benefit to that, but it also means that our identities, which are fundamentally linked to work, we're meant to work, we're meant to produce, we're meant to do things that benefit our neighbors. There's so much less certainty that any productive thing you do is still going to be useful to somebody else 1 month, 1 year, 1 decade from now. And I think there's a ton of angst in that. And the idea that what people really needed, I don't know if Zuckerberg ever really said it precisely that way, but the idea that linking everybody together would give you this ability to have all these conversations that would make everything, heavenly, well, that's just nuts. Because the main thing people want is a family The main thing they want is a few deep friendships, where you go after work in the evening. I think work is fundamental to our identity and happiness, but where you go afterwards and whether or not there's somebody who actually wants you bodily present to break bread with them and say you're needed, that's infinitely more important than how many Facebook friends you have. I think there's some data that actually shows the more social media relationships you have, the less likely you are to know the person who lives 2 doors from you. And happiness is highly correlated to knowing the person 2 doors from you. It's not correlated to having 500 versus 5,000 social media friends. I think what that really does is it expands your denominator for potential unhappiness. You know, when you're a little kid and your mom's, you know, setting up the house for Christmas Eve or whatever holiday you're about to celebrate as a family, it's a pretty great thing when you're 7 that you don't have awareness of some famine or war that's happening on the other side of the world, because you're around that hearth with these people who love you, and life is pretty dang great. Now, when you become an adult, you can't be unaware of that distant stuff, but not to sound like an ancient Stoic, but you do want to be happy by making a meaningful difference in the things you can control. And there are people that I'm called to love that are right here or 20 feet away or 200 yards away. And I think we tend to have too much consciousness right now of a global community and not nearly enough consciousness of an actual neighborhood around you.
You're the current chairman of the Senate's Ancient Stoic Committee. Is that correct?
I'm the chairman of a group of 1.
Yes. Could you link
Contentious elections.
Can you link what you've just talked about to anger in politics?
Sure. I mean, just maybe nut picking is a good place to pick up, right? Less than 14% of Americans pay attention to politics on a daily basis. A lot of people do that out of a sense of duty, so there's some thoughtful, engaged people in that 14%. But by and large, those 14% are pretty weird. The people who are making politics a primary community for themselves are displacing other communities that are more relevant today. Let's be clear, I'm of the Eisenhowerian one cheer for politics school. You know, the idea that government is the enemy, which is just a sort of shorthand for lazy right-wing stump speeches sometimes, isn't true. Government is necessary to maintain a framework for ordered liberty, but it's mostly freedom from, so that you're free to do all the stuff you're supposed to do in terms of your actual local callings. And right now there are a whole bunch of those 14%. And I think this is one of the places where Donald Trump is kind of illustrative more than causal. I think there's about 7-8% of America. Let's do a 2x2 matrix. If you've got an x-axis, which is ideology, and so you've got progressive, center-left, center-right, whatever we're going to call the right in the future. The crowd out of the middle on that axis, the evaporation of the moderates, is pretty obvious in the data. Pew and Gallup, I think, say that in the mid-90s, about 26% of Americans defined themselves as moderates, and they were higher propensity voters than people right and left of them. Today, about 7% of Americans define themselves as centrists or moderates, and they're less likely to vote than people right and left of them.
What has caused that? Is this just social pressure, tribalism? What is that? What is that makes radical centrism so irrelevant in the conversation right now?
So I'll answer you first, but I want to make sure we have the
do the
framework of where we're
matrix,
going next. Let's do a y-axis of political engagement or attention for a second. We'll come back to mine, but stay at yours for a minute. I think in a world where it's more 1870 than 1900, if we're living through a digital revolution which is transforming the nature of work, and one of the only analogs to it would be industrialization and urbanization in the late 19th century, cities were pretty dang uninhabitable in 1870. By 1910, they were nice places to live. But you went from having lots of thick community and social capital of the Tocquevillian agrarian village, and people knew each other, they had common cause, they had purpose, and they had a consciousness and identity that was about things they could largely control. What was happening way off in distant politics didn't capture their attention most of the time. But when you move to cities with early industrialization, because of push and pull factors, pull to factory, push from agriculture that had become so much more productive with new technologies, you didn't need as many people to do it. Ultimately, cities became habitable, but it wasn't politics that got us there. It was the rebuilding of a lot of social capital in those cities when you arrived. And I think that sense that you're living through a disrupted period, 1870s New York, Boston, weren't great places to live. By 1900, 1910, they're interesting again. I think if we're living through a revolution, a digital revolution, the nature of work, sense of identity related to productivity, there's a lot of sense that people are helpless. And so then you want politics to solve this distant, disrupted challenge, and politics isn't well equipped to do that. So I think the evaporation of the center is partly ideological as people look for politicians right and left to solve their problems. But I think the bigger issue is this y-axis of attention, and that gets to your point about social media and the way we engage, the way we get our information or our news. If your y-axis is political engagement, the middle evaporating there is a much bigger problem than the middle that's evaporating ideologically. And I think the upper tier is political addiction. The lower tier is disengagement. And the middle tier is like normal people, middle brow. I've got a duty to be engaged as a citizen, but I don't want this to be my primary community. I care about my neighborhood, my co-religionists, I care about my sports team loyalties. People who want their main tribe to be people who happen to share their same politics, they're pretty weird. And I think we have media consumption that is now everybody who wants to pay attention to politics thinks they need to do it as an addict or they need to disengage. And so I think the middle of America, again, in terms of attention middle, is disengaging because they don't want to be a part of this 14% that's addicted.
Can you, I don't want to veer away from this totally egg-headed conversation because I'm enjoying it, but can you talk about...
Like the Stoic caucus of
Yeah,
seven.
the Stoics meet the eggheads. They walk into a bar. Could you talk about this in the context of your constituents in red state Nebraska? You know,
Sure.
we all have possibly distorted understanding of the Trumpian movement because we watch video from rallies and we watch January 6th video, obviously, and you know, it becomes our impression, or my impression at least, that the boiling anger inside the core of the Republican Party has become really toxic. What are you seeing in Nebraska that cuts against the understanding that the majority of Republicans now are these hyper angry, white ethno-nationalist, resentment-based, anti-democratic almost kind of voters who are going to, by 2024, really threaten the nature of our democracy? Is there anything that you're seeing on the ground among the Republicans of Nebraska that says, you know what, most people are actually not all in on that?
Well, I mean, I feel like I might sound like a broken record on this, and I annoy some of the Capitol Hill press corps with it. But the way we cover politics as short-term tribal reaction to reaction to reaction, it's nonsense, and the vast majority of people don't want anything to do with it. So I don't mean to sound self-serving about it, but I'm by far the largest vote getter in the history of Nebraska. I'm one of 9 people in the U.S. Senate who's never been a politician until I ran in 2014. And I just got reelected in 2020. And I had a Trumpy primary. I got 76% of the vote. When I was getting primaried, that was really newsy. When I got 76% of the vote, it was no longer sexy. In the general election, I got the most votes anybody's ever gotten in the history of Nebraska, despite President Trump telling people to not vote for me 3 or 4 weeks before that election. And I got censured by the state Republican Party of Nebraska and by the county GOPs. There are somewhere between 120 and about 400 people who are really active in state politics out of a state of 2 million. And I get censured by the party. I voted for impeachment after the January 6th moment. And so I got censured repeatedly for that. Those censures are news, but the fact that I set the all-time vote record isn't news. The vast majority of people don't want to do politics like this. I had a reporter shove her iPhone into my ribcage in early August on Capitol Hill saying, "You've been ducking us all day." I was like, really? I didn't know you were looking for me. My team's pretty good. If you reached out to my office and I didn't respond, I'm sorry, but that's not like us. Tell me more. What am I ducking you on? And she was, you know, winsome and high EQ, so she de-escalates. And she goes, I don't mean you're really ducking us. It's just, we want to know. And she, you know, references some other folks on the press corps with her. We want to know, what do you think about what Matt Gaetz said, about what AOC said, about what Marjorie Taylor Greene did? And I don't give a shit. Like that in a republic, nobody should care about that. You just named 3 people who aren't serious adults. They don't actually have an agenda for 2030 America. And the reason I ran for re-election is because I'm worried about the future of work, the future of war, the First Amendment culture in a world that moves to primarily digital rather than in-person public squares.
Let me just push back on something. You say that they're nonsense and fine, you know, or they're ridiculous, not serious people. you're talking about people who can and already have, in some ways, instigated violence that can tip our society into some kind of dystopian new reality. I mean, how do you? Fine, I recognize that Marjorie Taylor Greene is not the norm among elected Republicans.
Nor is AOC the norm, which is why she got 8 votes when she tried to take down the Iron Dome funding. And yet the press acts like AOC, not all the press, but it's very typical to act like AOC speaks for like 60% of 51% of the country. That's nonsense. It's just these people are really good at doing short-term screaming.
Is it? I'll come back to the violence thing if we have a moment. But is what you're saying that it sounds like you're saying that the press and sort of social media echo chambers are creating this idea that the extremists really have much more power over ordinary, maybe actively engaged citizens, but ordinary citizens than they actually do, and so that it's up to the press?
No, I don't mean that. I think we're going through a revolution of technology that makes us consume in different ways. That when we used to have 3 channels, not everything was great about that. You couldn't watch I couldn't watch the college football game you wanted to watch, but in the late 1950s, I Love Lucy had something like a 68% weekly share and a 91% monthly share. I Love Lucy wasn't important content, don't mishear me, but it was shared content. And so to the degree that technology and media consumption habits have both pros and cons, we should recognize some of the cons. My oldest kid is 20. In her entire lifetime, the most watched programming in America was Sunday Night Football for 3 weeks in 2014, hit a 12% share. We used to have a world where a lot of times there were 70 and 80 and 90% issues people could talk about in common. Now, when a really high watermark is an 8% or a 10% or a 12% moment, the political addicts become another niche. But that's not what the American public wants. I'll cite some polling from last summer. When you ask the American people, do you identify more as a Republican or more as a Democrat, and you don't give them a none of the above option as an answer, it still wins. 46% of the public pushes back on the question and says, I don't like any of those people. I don't want those parties representing me. I think it was 29% lean Democrat, 25% lean Republican, and 46% say, screw you, that's a dumb question. I don't like those people. Our politics are overwhelmingly anti-politics, and the clickbait ways that we respond to it implies that people are actually for a far left agenda or for your ethno-nationalist right-wing agenda when they're not. Most people are voting against the opposite extreme, not for something. We need a politics of vision, not a politics of grievance.
Last question for you, and it's a large question, and you have to answer it efficiently. Then what's
like
the way out?
Like the last few questions.
Yeah, what's the way out of this? I mean, we're heading toward toward an election. We have now the precedent of a president of the United States denying the reality of an election result. We haven't really had that experience. That, as you well know, is filtering down, maybe not into the average Nebraska voter, but at the county level, the people you're talking about who are censuring you. This is becoming a new norm. It says, if you lose your election, don't consent to the loss. You know, and all of democracy hinges on the willingness of the loser to concede to the winner. So how do you? What's the off ramp for all of this before we hit this 2024 moment that could end up on January 20th, 2025, with 2 people claiming the White House, which has a very kind of non-democratic vibe to it.
Well said. Okay, let's speak to the point you're making procedurally about democracy over the last year and over the next 3. But I still think from where you started, Jeff, we have to go up one more level because the political addiction conversation is not actually representative of what people need or want in a long-term republic. But to your point, I think I've been pretty clear that the election of Joe Biden, I acknowledged him right away that first week, and then when the new president, or when the outgoing president said all the nonsense and now is conducting and trying to get other states to conduct these audits, which continually show that Joe Biden won the election, people telling the truth is really essential to the maintenance of a republic. We just don't do basic civics enough so that the vast majority of Americans don't even know what happened in 1800 and why it was so glorious that John Adams willingly vacates the White House and Thomas Jefferson takes over, and folks in Europe say, well, that must be fake news. There must be some myth because nobody's ever willingly laid down power before. You couldn't have this Cincinnatus moment. And the glories of, it wasn't January, I guess it was March, 1801, pardon me, as Adams leaves office and allows Jefferson to go in, that should be a moment that all American school kids celebrate. It should be a basis of patriotism. The most read document in American history until the Civil War, after the Bible, but the most read political document in America wasn't the Declaration of Independence, wasn't the Constitution, it was Washington's farewell address. And the idea that in 1796, Washington would plan to explain to the American people, and his former revolutionary soldiers had this Society of Cincinnatus to celebrate this idea of willingly laying down power, that belief is predicated on understanding that political power is not the center of life or identity.
Right.
In a republic, the only way things actually work is if there's a broad-based understanding of meaning being somewhere other than the seats of political power.
Well, we have to wrap, but let me just stay on this for one more second. I just want to know what is, you're a political leader, what is the way out of this? And you're right, to borrow from Saddam Hussein, the mother of all norms in America is that politicians give up power peacefully. How do you keep your party from becoming anti-small d democratic?
Well, first of all, there aren't political parties in America right now. There's only the last guy who won. So I'm not doing sort of false symmetry here. But the idea that there's some mandate, you and I decided, or we were kicking around as this interview started, how much time we'd spend on current events today. But this idea that there's a mandate for radical change in D.C. in a country where the American people just decided to elect Joe Biden president and to give the Republicans the majority in the Senate, and then Donald Trump decided to go to Georgia and make sure that Republicans lost our majority. Donald Trump stole the majority of the Senate Republican majority from our party by electing Democrats in Georgia because he wanted to say the lie that he won the election over and over again. And it turns out voters didn't want to do that. Suburban Republican women in Georgia decided to elect Democrats to the Georgia Senate seats because they were tired of Donald Trump being on the stage lying that he won an election that he didn't win. So it would be worth recognizing that the American people decided to flip 2 Senate seats in Georgia because they didn't want that to happen. But now we pretend, or regularly there's talk on Capitol Hill, that acts like there's some mandate for the largest legislative package, at least since the Great Society programs of the 60s and maybe since the 1930s. That's not true. The American people don't want this $3.5 trillion, 17 issue area reconciliation bill. And yet people do that because they misread anti-politics as a mandate for something. Another thing we could do is we could celebrate the fact that Mike Pence told the truth on January 6th and refused to participate in these things. It turns out lots and lots of Republicans don't actually want that kind of frenzied addiction to the moment, which says power is the only thing that matters. What most people want is to have a democratic republicanism that is stable a decade into the future so they can figure out how they're going to navigate work disruptions and help their kids plan for a world where we're going to have to create a civilization of lifelong workers. We've not been very good at having the long-term conversation, and a republic is sustained by those healthy middle-brow people saying one cheer for politics.
Well, we could go on, but we can't. We're not allowed to. We have to move on to the next thing of the...
We're submitting to Charles. Your assistant here, who decided we have to end the interview at 25 minutes, also called you an Amish rock star when we were kicking off.
That's deeply decontextualized, and we'll talk about that privately. But I wanted to thank you for coming to the Atlantic Festival, and we'll see you on stage, I hope, live in front of a live studio audience next year. Thank you very much, Senator Ben Sasse.
Thanks,
appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
Hello, I'm Sharon Marcel. I'm the current head of BCG Fed, the Chief Marketing Officer and head of the client team, and very excited to also be the incoming chair of North America. I am joined today in this conversation by my dear friend and colleague, Brooke Boyke. Brooke also happens to be a worldwide expert on the future of work. So Brooke, it's great to be here with you today. A lot has been written about the future of work, but a lot of what has been written about the private sector and actually pretty narrowly focused. So if you think about it, an enormous amount of what's being said and written and discussed is around the topic of location. Whether you work from home, whether you work in the office, what are the implications in terms of footprint and real estate and costs? What are the implications in terms of collaboration? And actually much less is being written about ways of working and other things. And I think you and I have discussed this for the public sector. There's so much more opportunity in the future of work than just location.
So completely agree, Sharon. And it's great to be here talking with you today about this topic I know we both feel so passionate about. When we think about the public sector and future of work, I think it's really crucial for a few reasons. The first is that the public sector really does have its own nuances, and most of what we've been talking about has been private sector oriented, and it's unrealistic, in my view, to think that you can just lift and shift things over to the public sector. There are certain adaptations that you'll need to make, and it's time for us to be talking about specifically what those are and how to make it work within that environment. It's also important because it's a really large part of our workforce and our economy. If you think about the federal workforce alone, it's about 3 million people. And then you add on state, you add on local, you add on our education system on top of all of that. It's a vast number of people, and it's disproportionately skewed towards the knowledge economy. So knowledge workers are those workers, as you know, who are creating and consuming intellectual capital. And that part of our economy is much more impacted by these future of work trends than, say, the service economy or other pieces of it. So large workforce needs its own nuances, lots of knowledge workers, and those are the direct impacts. And then when we take it even a step further and think about the indirect impacts, think about what our public servants have been doing for the last year, okay? Running our vaccine response, keeping planes in the air, keeping our food safe, keeping our schools open. I could go on and on. It's really crucial for our day-to-day livelihoods and our quality of life to have an engaged, effective, productive public workforce. So this is something that's really important for us to be tackling head on. To the second point you were making around the when and the where of work, I completely agree. That's been the focus so far of this discourse, and it makes sense why, because it's the acute issue that everyone's dealing with. Do I get up on Monday and go into the office, or do I stay working from my living room couch? It's something that decisions we need to make right now. Can I still work my standard hours that I want to work, or do I need to go back to 9 to 5, right? The challenge is I don't think you can fully solve for those in isolation. There's a bigger picture. There's a holistic picture of not just where and when, but also what and how. So what is the work that we're doing, and how is that changing, and how are we going about collaborating and accomplishing that work? And by solving for all of these together, you'll be able to look at the what and the where much more effectively.
I couldn't agree more, Brooke. I think that's spot on. Even when we've discussed this, what is the when and the where really about? It is about location. It is about where you physically are, but there's also a bigger part of that. So it really is about flexibility. And will I have the flexibility that I want to get my job done? Will I have agency and actually control over the work that I do? And actually also trust. Does my employer trust me to get the work done in the place that is best suited to do that? So I think there are big topics even underneath this notion of where. You mentioned other things, so let's talk a little bit about the how. So you and I have been working differently in our casework and with our clients. We've been using more collaboration tools, more video conferences, different agile ways of working, which includes huddles, which includes inventorying of things we're getting done. And so we're continuing to evolve kind of the how in the ways that we work. And I think all of those things are super important. I also think some of what we've been doing in terms of really thinking about working groups and pushing decision-making down to the lowest possible level is key, because I think that is about trust, and that is also about agency, and that is also about getting people really excited that they are making decisions to drive their own work and to drive their own outcomes. And so I think the how we're getting work done, that conversation needs to continue. And then I think the other part Brooke, that you and I have talked about also is the journey. And if you think about my job or your job or our colleagues' job, our jobs are going to change. They're going to change tomorrow, they're going to change next week, and they're going to change next year. And so our ability to do our jobs in our swim lanes today are good, but more importantly is our ability to actually get better and actually have the flexibility and the self-determination to change as we move forward. So much has been said about the growth mindset. I know you and I believe in that, entirely. And having the courage and having the excitement to take on new challenges, even if you may fail a little bit in those new challenges, I think is such a critical part of the work we do and such a critical part of the future of work, because I think it will prepare us all to be more resilient, and I think we'll enjoy our work more as well.
And it makes me think of a time, we've been working together now for about 10 years, I think. And I worked for you on my very first engagement. And I remember distinctly as a part of that, when I had gotten some not complimentary feedback, some very direct feedback, which was right, it was correct, it was spot on, but it didn't make me feel very good. And I remember you pulling me aside and saying, Brooke, feedback is information. Absorb it and move on. And I mean, I literally, I can see the image still. I can see what you were wearing because it was so meaningful to me, because what it told me was, it's okay to try things and make mistakes. It's okay to stretch yourself. I'm not going to be in trouble because I've made a mistake. And that really helped me to have a growth mindset and to keep trying and being more ambitious and experiment with different things. And I think you as a manager helped to create that environment where that was possible. And I think that when we think about that, we also need to, immediately bridge to this idea of psychological safety, because that type of a conversation can't happen without an environment where someone feels safe bringing things up, right? And you actually see not just this open collaboration, but you also see something like a 70% increase in creativity and just the general quality of what people do by having the psychological safety as well.
So Brooke, that really resonates with me. As you know, a lot has been written about the Great Resignation. And if you think about where that's coming from, so many employees have taken jobs over the last couple of years where they've never had the opportunity to come into the office. They've never met their boss. They've never met their colleagues. And so they're distant from the culture, and in fact, in some cases, distant from the work and where that delivers in terms of outcome. And I think the Great Resignation actually produces an opportunity for us, both at BCG and also in the public sector. And I call it the Great Recalibration. I mean, it's an opportunity for us, Brooke, to actually really think about re-recruiting our workforce every day by giving them meaningful work, by connecting their work to outcomes, connecting their work to mission. And I think at BCG, whether we're doing climate or whether we're doing AI, we have a tremendous opportunity to do that. But in the public sector, even more so, because the work that gets done is so clearly attached to the mission. And I think that can be a great connector in terms of the future of work.
And another attribute to think about in terms of engagement is learning and development. So learning and development is highly correlated with employees feeling engaged, and even more so among knowledge economy employees, who tend to be even more motivated by intellectual engagement. I'm going to put a bold idea out there. Okay? What if our federal government, instead of just being a consumer of talent and skills, is a manufacturer of talent and skills? And I'm thinking in particular in some of those skill set areas that we know are a broader gap for our economy around data and digital and analytics. So think about this. If you would like to become a pilot, the most elite thing you can do is join the Air Force or the Navy, right? That's where you'll get the most elite training. What if you wanted to be a programmer and your first choice was to go join a rotational program in the federal government, where you got to work on exciting and meaningful projects across a variety of agencies, maybe shift in and out of the public and the private sector, and really lift the capacity of the government itself to provide services, but also contribute to the overall skill set of our broader economy?
I think that's a fabulous idea, Brooke. I love your bold idea. I think it's amazing. And look, it's been just a pleasure talking to you about this topic today. I think you have so many great ideas, and I want to thank you so much for your time. And I also want to thank the Atlantic, because without the Atlantic, we wouldn't have had this wonderful opportunity. So big shout out to you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Sharon. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you to everyone for listening. We'd love to continue the conversation with you. Please visit us at bcg.com.
Here's Atlantic staff writer Amanda Mull.
Fashion has long been aimed at size zero women, especially when it comes to luxury. Attitudes about body image have begun to shift in the last few years, and more clothing is being made for people of different sizes and shapes. Fashion designer Christian Siriano has been at the forefront of this fashion movement. Joining me now is Christian Siriano.
How are you?
Hello, good morning. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, Christian, I wanted to talk a little bit first about the background of your career and how your brand has evolved since you started it. What was the industry's attitude toward body diversity when you started your eponymous brand?
Yeah, I think, gosh, I mean, in the very beginning, when we first, when I really decided that I want to have maybe a curvier model on the runway, I guess what was most interesting is that it wasn't just really available. There weren't a lot of, agencies that were supplying models. That wasn't just something that didn't happen. So I thought that was very interesting, and I guess that's why I was pretty curious what would happen, what the reaction would be. And I think in the first show that we ever did, which was years ago now, I think the reaction was mixed. I think some people really loved it and loved seeing someone like themselves in the clothes, and I think other people didn't understand because fashion, even though moves very quickly and there's a lot of innovators in fashion, sometimes they can be very stuck in their ways, which is interesting, kind of a contradiction, but now we've learned that I think it really changes people's perception of like our brand and what we can do, and that's kind of the best part.
Right. You mentioned it was hard to find models of different sizes when you started out. What was the general reaction of the industry when you started? Because I know that a lot of steps go into putting on a fashion show, from finding fit models to finding investors, people who are willing to sign on to your vision. Was there any resistance because of your interest in body diversity?
I mean, I think there's always like there's always a little pushback whenever you try something different, especially in this business, which is really interesting. I think everybody gets worried because it's not the same way that it's been done for so long, or there weren't people available. That just wasn't a part of the business that I think the industry was really focused on, which is so interesting because it's such a big part of the business, such a big, I think important role. I think, what the average, person really, what is their size? What are they buying? So that was really, I was very more curious about that. So I think that everyone on the financial side was excited for a new opportunity, but everybody kind of on the creative side wasn't sure if it was going to work. But I think I knew it was. Yeah.
And of course, in fashion, there are the businesses, and then there are the shoppers. And sometimes those two groups can be at odds about certain ideas or certain emphasis. What was the reaction from shoppers at the same time that the industry was sort of resistant to some of this change?
Yeah, no, it's all about the consumer now. I mean, and I think, everybody, after the pandemic, I think every brand, every company, every business really has realized, even more now than ever, that the customer, the consumer, whoever's shopping your brand is the most important person in the room. Who cares about anybody else? I don't care what people are saying about the collection. As long as people are buying it and interested, that's the only way to kind of survive and build and grow. And I think, that attention was so important. And I think, having extended sizes for all these different types of shapes and people too, not just women's wear, maybe it's men's, maybe it's non-binary, whatever it is, you can't kind of alienate a customer anymore. I think that that's the biggest lesson everyone's kind of realized. But it's the best of both worlds. You get a new customer and you make people feel great. So I don't know why the disconnect happened for so long.
Right. How have things changed? When did you start to notice things shifting? Has that change accelerated in the past few years?
Yeah, I think I think awareness is a really big part of like our culture and what's happening in our world. People are so much more aware. They're so much more in tune. They're so much more savvy now because everything is at their fingertips, you know. And I think when I started my business, there was no social media. The iPhone just came out. This was in 2008. Twitter just launched in 2008. So that's wild to think about. That's when I started my brand. So now thinking about today, I think it's a much more, you know, world where people are, you know, just in tune with what's happening. And I think the person who is maybe a curvier woman she was fed up with not having representation. So I think that's why it had to change. I think representation in general, you kind of can't get away from it anymore, which I love. And it's so fun to watch a big brand suffer and try to figure it out. I love it.
Speaking of representation, you in particular have had enormous success, I think, with celebrity dressing and with dressing celebrities of diverse body types, of diverse gender presentations, of all kinds of different people. What role has that had for you in your business, and also just more broadly in pushing this conversation forward?
Yeah, I think the idea of, I mean, we've dressed so many different types of people, everyone, all such fabulous, amazing people. And, you know, I think early in my career, I think that also helped, you know, people understand that we can, you know, have clothes for all these different types of women, all these different types of people in general, men. You know, and I think just early on, I was like, well, you know, getting a call, you know, oh, we want you to dress Oprah for the first time. And I'm like, are we saying no to Oprah because she's a curvy woman? Like, that wouldn't make sense to me. So I think that was kind of that was just how I approached it. I was just excited to get an opportunity, and, you know, and we still get excited. I think, you know, I still think that's a big part of what I love about fashion. So if you take that away, then some days aren't as exciting as the others.
And what kind of opportunity does that represent to just get your ideas and get your point of view in front of the general public that might not be there for luxury fashion otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, any kind of prominent person that you dress or work with, I mean, it really is just kind of a walking representation of your work. You know, it's a way of advertising what you do or what you can do. And obviously a lot of it's very fantasy evening because it's very red carpet driven, but sometimes it can just be, you know, a beautiful suit on the fabulous Michelle Obama, you know, things like that. And that has really changed our business because I think then people see themselves in the clothes that way, you know, and each kind of maybe actress or musician or political person, they have their own fan base. You know, sometimes people forget that everybody has their kind of niche in their world. But there is enough, I think, you know, for everyone to be inspired. And so I think that's also just what's still fun about the business of fashion. For me, I still love that. I never know who's going to call. I never know what they're going to want. It's still kind of exciting.
Is there an extra fun or an extra pleasure in getting to dress people that have maybe previously been overlooked by fashion and luxury?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's really, it always feels great to make some, you know, kind of the underdog always look really fabulous or look amazing, incredible. It's my favorite thing to do, probably because I think I'm really good at making I'm good at making people look great. So I think that's my job though. So I think that's, I mean, that's kind of the only job of a brand or fashion designer, is to kind of like, we're creating, you know, art that people live their lives in. So it's like, you have to kind of, I think, do a good job at it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You also design gender fluid clothing. Have you seen an uptick in demand for that?
You know, I think there's a big opportunity here to definitely change and grow. I think the idea is more about that maybe clothing will be a bit genderless at some point in some way. I don't think it'll ever be completely a genderless world. Unfortunately, we will never have that. We're a too divided place, but I do think it's a big change. I think people want to wear what they want to wear. and at the end of the day, really, there are no rules, there are no laws. The last that I checked. So I think if someone wants to wear a dress, and whoever that person is, they should be able to wear a dress. I always thought that that was kind of interesting, because there's no higher up telling us we can't wear something or be something. So I think that's what's great about our culture. That's what we love about it. We want to be who we want to be.
Do you think that there's still a stigma attached to this type of fashion, or is that sort of evolving?
I mean, it's evolving, but there will be a stigma forever for some, probably just because there will always be people that don't understand, and people are afraid of what they don't understand. So I think that will always be there. But I think that's okay. Some days I kind of feel like it's okay. It needs to be obviously more, such more the norm and more prominent. But then I think if we're all the same and all agreeing on everything, then maybe it doesn't feel that we're actually accomplishing something sometimes. I don't know. So that's how I approach it two different ways some days. And it's hard to figure out what's the right answer. But I'm excited that it definitely is evolving for sure.
When other designers get asked questions about designing for diverse bodies, whether that is size-wise or gender-wise, some of the reasons why they maybe hesitate to do it that come up are often that there are technical challenges in creating clothes for a bigger array of bodies. Are there technical challenges? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, of course. There's but that's really kind of with any project. That's like if you're a car brand and you want to build the biggest, newest, best model. I mean, it's all the same. It's how you approach it. So I think, of course, definitely like all different bodies are different shapes and sizes. And, the bigger the dress, or the pattern is, the size, the fabrication, there's more. It's sometimes can be a bit more expensive. I mean, there's all the things. But I really feel like that's with any product that ranges in a size. So but you have to set out to be prepared for that. And any designer that doesn't really know that or isn't really interested in that, it's kind of just, I don't think it's kind of an excuse, but a strange excuse, because of course that's the process. Yeah.
Right. Shifting gears a little bit, sustainability is also a big deal for you. And sustainability is a topic that the fashion industry gets hammered on a little bit. What are you and your company doing to make an effort to make things more sustainable?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty fortunate that we still have a pretty small brand for what we do. Small carbon footprint, small studio. It's a small team. We don't really. My actual Christian Siriano brand, we're not in the mass production of clothing. We're not working directly with dye houses, any of those things. So that's been, and I really love that. I think it's super important. I think we're in a really hard place right now, because the world of fast fashion and the world of luxury, the hard part of it is that obviously fast fashion was created because of the of kind of like the economics of our world. There's a big generation and a big generation coming up that really doesn't spend money on clothes. So how do you get it to them? What's the process of that? So we're at a pretty hard place to try to figure out, do we need 100,000 units of one sweater, and if they're selling, okay, I understand. But if they're not, where do they go? What's happening? What's the process of making them? So I think that's now what we have to figure out, because I do think there's still a demand for a large consumer, but we have to figure out a way to make it a bit more ethical. It's just the challenge. And I think that's going to go down to literally like every single element. What is the button made out of? How does this become a pink color? We can't, I think all of those things. Yeah.
Absolutely. You, speaking of sort of like thinking outside of the box and finding new ways to do things, you and your company made millions of masks during the pandemic. You were one of the first companies to step up when New York State asked people to start making masks. What was that experience like? And do you think that that sense of civil duty is present in other areas of your company in the normal course of business?
Yeah, it's something I kind of fell into. I think I never set out to be, like a political designer necessarily, but it's kind of just keeps kind of falling into place. And I think, it's one of those things that you can't really plan for. You could never show to an investor, this is what we're doing, this is going to how the business will change. They would never understand in a way, because it was never a goal. And especially the mask, that whole project, and I call it a project because it became one. And but in the beginning, it was a very reactionary idea that turned into something bigger and grander, and we feel super proud of what we did. But first when you react to something and then it's kind of like, oh, you have to hold up your end of the bargain, I think, or you have to hold up, you wouldn't want to let someone down. So I guess that's always how I approach it. That's what dressing, the underdog, or, working for a brand that maybe not everybody wants, that you wouldn't expect to work with. All of those things, I think, are actually just a bit more important to me now, because I think they leave behind something greater than just fabulous clothes. Maybe they leave behind a bit more of a purpose. So I think if I was out of business tomorrow because of a pandemic, I would feel really good about what we did. That's how I approach it now.
Great. Well, I think our time is out, but Christian Siriano, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Yeah, thank you so much. So appreciate it.
And now, please welcome Atlantic Senior Editor, Van R. Newkirk II.
Democracy. It's one of the things that first comes to mind for lots of Americans when they think about the country, when they think about our values, and what this place was even built on. Democracy is part of the spirit of our founding documents, from the Declaration of Independence to the Constitution. But when you really get to thinking about it, all that lofty language doesn't really hold up, does it? I mean, we all know enslaved folks couldn't vote, and black men weren't even nominally granted full citizenship until 1868. And that grant only really kind of lasted until the end of Reconstruction a decade later. And we know women, well, white women, couldn't vote until the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. When you think about Jim Crow, anti-Asian American voting laws, and the disenfranchisement of indigenous folks, you're really only looking at the last half century or so, after the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, when adults of all identities had some reasonable expectation that they might be able to vote. But if you get a little deeper than that, even that 50 years isn't all it seems. States that still wanted very much to stop black folks from voting worked hard to do so. The Shelby County versus Holder decision in 2013 weakened the VRA and gave lots of them the chance. Laws designed expressly to make it harder to vote have proliferated, especially in some states with the biggest black populations. Gerrymandering has reshaped American political maps and has often taken power away from people of color. In lots of places, people with felonies still can't vote. People in Puerto Rico and Guam still can't vote in federal elections. And in the last couple years, laws that restrict registration and voting by mail have expanded, as has draconian enforcement of those laws, making criminals of lots of folks who just want to do what they have been told is the most American thing. Now, ask yourself, is that really democracy? Or is it something else?
Please welcome Atlantic contributing writer Jamel Hill.
In 2020, we saw an unprecedented rise of attacks against people of Asian descent. And in this conversation, we plan to discuss how these attacks happen, what led to them, what can we do about them, and what can we do going forward to prevent this kind of hatred in this country. I'm so pleased to be joined by Lisa Ling, who is host and executive producer of This Is Life with Lisa Ling, which premieres October 10th on CNN, and also Eva Chen, who is got a number of jobs and a very, very, very big title. She is the vice president of fashion and shopping partnerships at Instagram. And I'm also, let me not forget, also a children's book author. Pleased to be joined by you both, and thank you for joining us for this very important conversation. So let's start with where things stand today. Obviously, over the last year, there has been a lot of conversation about the hatred and the attacks on Asian Americans. Where do you think we stand today? And Lisa, I'll begin with you.
Well, Jamel, thanks so much for hosting this session. Look, I wish I could say that things have gotten better, but whenever I open social media, I seem to see more attacks on Asian people, particularly on our seniors. I definitely think there's more awareness about it, but when you stop and think about it, our Asian American history isn't taught in America. And the reality is that Asian Americans have been scapegoated and discriminated against for centuries, since Asian people first landed on US soil. And so while many people have been surprised by this, the scapegoating of Asians in the last year and a half since COVID became rooted here, it really has been just this pattern of discrimination that has existed for so long in this country.
Eva, what are your thoughts?
And what Lisa said so articulately as usual. I mean, I remember the first time I heard the expression China virus, and I immediately had this like feeling in the pit of my stomach thinking like, oh no, like this is not going to be good. And, soon thereafter, I started telling my parents to wear hats and sunglasses and scarves to hide the fact that they were Asian. As Lisa pointed out, so many of the attacks are on our elders, and they pop up in the news every so often, mainstream news. I see them a lot on social media because of the amplification on Instagram, for instance, people like Lisa or myself talking about these horrific incidents. But, they're still happening. They might not just be as talked about as much. But I just read about a woman who was sitting in her car and who she was punched while in a parking lot. And it's disheartening and incredibly scary, I think, especially some of these incidents happen in front of children.
Eva, as Lisa alluded to, these attacks on people of Asian descent are not necessarily new in this country, but it did seem to reach a different point. How much, one of the contributing factors seemed to be high-profile people in leadership positions continuing to gaslight and demonize the Asian community. Eva, how much did that have to do with this anti-Asian sentiment seeming to explode in this country over the last year?
I think there's a lot of othering of Asians where, I grew up in the US. I was, I'm a native New Yorker, and, still when I walk down the street, someone will be like, well, where are you from? And I'll be like, oh, I grew up in the village, in the 80s. And they'll be like, where are you from though? And, that happens to me often, like when I'm even in a taxi or an Uber or like at a doctor's office. And it might seem innocent, but there is a pervasiveness to it that kind of makes people feel like they're not a part of American culture. And it's one of the reasons why I think right now representation obviously is so important, but seeing movies like Shang-Chi, the new Marvel movie with Simu Liu kind of hit the top of the box office, or seeing books by Asian authors hit the top of the New York Times bestseller list, things like that I think are definitely helping. And also just people being more vocal. I mean, I know that I feel like I really found my voice in the last 2 years, feeling as though that, we have to stand up and speak for others. I know that when I was younger, I felt definitely more shy. And I think there's a part of Asian culture where you're taught to hold your voice back and not to cause any fuss, and to kind of just like hide a little bit and don't cause any trouble. But I think this new generation of activists, of voices, is so inspiring to me. And seeing the hashtag, for instance, Stop Asian Hate on Instagram proliferate, and just kind of seeing all the people coming behind it from all different races, all different cultures, all different kinds of people has been incredibly encouraging and heartening for me.
We saw that President Biden, he signed a law that addressed some of this anti-Asian hate that's been going on. Lisa, what did you think about his decision to do this? And did you think it went far enough?
Well, I think that is one of the big differences between the the scapegoating of Asians that's happening today and what has happened in years prior. That the federal government is taking action, is enacting laws, is acknowledging the fact that this is happening and that Asian Americans belong in this country. When you look at what happened to Vincent Chin in the early 1980s, he was a young Chinese man working and living in Detroit. And this was during a period of economic downturn. Jamil, you know of this. You grew up in Detroit when a lot of blame was being placed on Japanese companies because they were building much more fuel efficient vehicles, and it became really easy to blame this foreign power that was coming in and taking people's jobs. And Vincent Chin was on his way to celebrate his bachelor party. He was actually in a bar with some friends and got into an altercation, and two white men essentially beat him to death and accused him of being Japanese. And it was one of the first times that this multi-Asian, multi-ethnic group of people banded together to protest what had happened and to demand civil rights for Vincent Chin. But it didn't get the kind of federal government support, corporate support that this movement now is getting. And that is a big difference. But having said that, you asked about what happens when leaders and political officials, make comments or refer to things like the coronavirus, the COVID-19, as the China virus. Well, it weaponizes this virus, and it allows for people to think in their minds that people of Asian descent may have had something to do with the reason why COVID has spread. And we all know that Asian people have had nothing to do with the spread of COVID in this country. And so this idea of expressing those words weaponized this virus, and that is one of the reasons why so many Asian people have been attacked in the last year and a half, and so violently, so violently and so brazenly.
You said a few moments ago, Lisa, about the importance of knowing, Asian history in this country and how it's just not being taught. And you decided with your show to tell the story of what happened to Vincent Chin. What made you decide that this was a story that you could use to sort of not only educate people about how anti-Asian hate is not new, but also to tell them a story that maybe might resonate with them and get them to see the issue differently? Why did you decide to address this story in particular?
So my show, This Is Life, has been on the air for now 8 seasons. Actually, our 8th season will be starting on October 10th. And it was during 2020, June of 2020, that people on social media started talking about Juneteenth. And I have to admit, I was really embarrassed that I knew very little about Juneteenth. I think I heard about it, but I didn't really know that it was such a consequential moment in American history. And so that propelled me to think about all of those moments in American history that aren't found in our history books. American history is told through a certain lens, right? It's told through the eyes of the victors, and that compelled my team and me to want to really dig into some of the stories that didn't make it into the books. And so we're dedicating our entire 8th season to those moments in American history that were significant, that impacted where we are today, but that we haven't really known about. And the Vincent Chin story is one of the moments in Asian American history that obviously was hugely significant. It really was the reason for the federal government to actually, it was the first civil rights case in American history involving an Asian American, but there's so many of these missed opportunities to look back at history to kind of figure out where we are and where we're going. And it's interesting right now that there's this fierce debate that is happening in our federal government, in school districts, in local legislatures about history. How can we deny that history can play a role in the things that we are experiencing, in the way we think, in the way we educate our children who are going to inherit the problems that we're dealing with today? So this denial of the importance of history, to me, is very dangerous. And so we've dedicated our whole season to trying to unearth those stories to help us figure out how they have affected, how we're living now.
As Eva said earlier, representation definitely matters. And along those same lines, Eva, you have companies like Warner Brothers and Disney who have now attached warnings to some of their older films because of how they depicted Asians in some of their films and movies and in pop culture. What do you make of companies doing that? Is this helpful in stopping these harmful stereotypes of Asians?
I mean, I think so. I have 3 kids. They are just beginning to get into the age where they love movies and watching, television and really love it. And you watch some of the older movies and there are dangerous stereotypes, not just about Asians, about many different cultures and races. And they're really harmful because children, I think, at a young age start internalizing messages, what's okay to say, what's not okay to say. Of course, they're learning from their parents, but they learn from pop culture, television, books as well. And it's one of the reasons why I think what Lisa's doing with her program is so amazing, because that's educating adults about history that might not have been taught to them. And it's one of the reasons why when I write children's books, representation is so important. I didn't know this was never taught to me growing up, but there was a Chinese American woman named Mabel Lee who was a suffragette, who was, led marches for the right for women to vote. A Chinese American woman who was also the first to attend Columbia University. And so even at a young age, like 3 years old, 4 years old, like that's the audience for my books, I am trying to have that message out there because I didn't have that growing up. And I still feel like I'm playing catch up on my own history. So I do think the warnings definitely help. But even more important is the studios need to greenlight more projects with Asian leads. Book publishers need to find books with more diverse voices, not just Chinese voices, not just Asian voices, but all voices. Because books really are a mirror and a window into other cultures, and you want to encourage kids to see the world through that perspective.
Now, on top of the othering, some of the harmful stereotypes that Asian Americans regularly face, there's also something called the bamboo ceiling. And I'll admit, I had not heard about this until I was doing preparation for this talk. Lisa, can you educate us on what a bamboo ceiling is, what that means?
Well, I think most of us who work in the corporate world recognize that there are many Asian people filling the roles of employment payrolls, right? Because there are a lot of people like to have Asian people on their staffs because they're generally an educated demographic that works very hard, but at a certain point, the number of Asians who are actually rising through the ranks and becoming executives is actually very small. In fact, Asian women are apparently the least likely to ascend up the corporate ladder. And there I think are a myriad of reasons why, but I think Eva can probably attest to the fact that as Asian women, I do believe that I have been overlooked in my career. I mean, there have been um, a number of incidents where someone who I believe had similar qualifications as I have, our shows performed commensurate. In some cases, my show may have even performed better, but somehow my male counterpart would, receive more promotion or even get renewed for more seasons. And I don't think that it has been malicious. I don't think there's been malice behind not promoting Asian women. I think that Asian women in particular have suffered from not being seen as much as our perhaps our white male counterparts. I think that is starting to change, but the statistics bear it out.
Eva, as somebody who is at the executive level at Instagram, what's your perspective on this?
I mean, I do think I do a lot of mentorship for young women who work at Instagram and do not work at Instagram. And a lot of them do tend to be young Asian American women who say, like, well, I feel like I'm passed over, or I'm asked to do like a lot of the work that is considered foundational, but then not given the recognition. And I think that part of it is that Asian American women often have the stereotype of being more passive, being very friendly, being very sweet, very quiet, and willing to do everything. But then other people, of course, as Lisa pointed out, might get the credit, the recognition, or the promotions. I spend a lot of time talking to Asian women and telling them to like own your voice, ask for what you think you deserve. And part of it is practice. I mean, you may have grown up in a household where, you know, you were told to be quiet or to kind of just like play by the rules. But in this new culture, owning your voice, having a voice, and using your platform, whether you have 10 followers, 10,000 followers, is really important. And the more you practice, the easier it gets. And that's what I've seen for myself, at least. You still get, we talk a lot as women about imposter syndrome, but I think the stakes are doubly, the stakes are double when you are a woman of color. The imposter syndrome, I think, is even deeper and more pervasive. And so I think it's like talking that through and also finding other women to share your feelings with, to kind of, I know Lisa and I like, you know, we DM and support each other in finding your own kind of cheer squad of people to help you through it.
You said something interesting earlier that you kind of recently found your voice in the last couple of years. Eva, what was it that inspired you or just made you feel compelled that you wanted to be more vocal about what was happening in your community and just being a voice, period, for Asian people?
Part of it is having children. Honestly, my daughter is 7 years old. She is half Chinese, half British, and I want her to have a strong connection to her Chinese side. For me, growing up, I've always felt like I lived in two worlds. Growing up in New York City, I was one of maybe three Asians in like my school growing up, and I felt very connected to my Chinese culture. I still speak purely Mandarin to my parents, but I really just felt like a deepening in the sense of my connection and heritage when I started having kids, because it made me understand my parents' journey as immigrants better. And that's something that I've been trying to understand as I spend time with them, understanding their struggles. I just wrote a book about the immigrant experience, children's book about the immigrant experience that's coming out next year. And part of that is like that connection to my family and trying to deepen that.
All right. As we wrap here, I want to get both of your perspectives on this. It feels like in this country, a lot of times things happen, incidents happen, and then for the moment, we all rally around it. We want to talk about it. We want to, kind of unpack how we got to a certain place. How do we maintain, for lack of a better way to put it, the momentum and remaining aware about the hateful sentiments, the harmful depictions against Asians in this country? How do we continue that momentum that was created by, unfortunately, a rise in hate attacks? Lisa, I'll start with you.
As long as Asian American history is not taught in our schools, when kids are young, this is when empathy is built, right? Is developed. And if Asian American history isn't taught, it becomes so easy to overlook an entire community, to judge an entire community, even dehumanize an entire community. So while there has been momentum in the last year and a half to combat acts of hate against Asians, we have to have a long-term goal of educating the American population, the global community, really, about the contributions that Asian Americans have played in this country, the triumphs that we have achieved, and recognize the fact that our history is American history. And I think by doing that, having a sort of a long-term goal of infusing the history curriculum for kids and young adults with Asian American history and BIPOC history, I think that will go a long way in allowing empathy, sympathy, and just a better understanding of our fellow humans to exist in this country.
And I think what Lisa's saying is absolutely foundational. You know, Asian American history has to be taught in schools. And I believe one state so far has passed a bill introducing it and making it mandating Asian American history should be taught. I also feel like we have to think about what we can do on the daily, right? You know, it can feel often that we're hopscotching from one kind of thing in current events to another. I think it's really important to keep a drumbeat of conversation around these issues, around these hate crimes, around these racist attacks. It's not pretty. It's not pretty to talk about. People might not want to hear about it, but we have to keep talking about it because it's still happening. So not being afraid to own your voice and share about it, talk to your friends about it, raise awareness for charities supporting Asian American seniors. There's one called Heart of Dinner that I love to support that provides meals for homebound elderly Asians in New York City's Chinatown. But just kind of using your platform to raise awareness and just continuing to talk about it. Keep that drumbeat going.
And I would just add, you know, it's so important to communicate also to our kids. And you know, Eva talking about these amazing kids books that are available to kids. Read them to your kids, whether they're Asian or not. My 8-year-old was in school a couple of months ago, and a boy called her Ching Chong. And her best friend, without missing a beat, said, "I will not be a bystander," and went off and told the teacher about what had happened to my daughter. And, you know, these are examples of, you know, educating our kids to be better and do better. And you know, I think that adults need to take a page from that as well.
Totally. I mean, I can't believe, like, I remember being called Ching Chong when I was 8 years old, and it's still happening. It's just so, it breaks the heart. But
And
it's
crumbling, right? I mean, I wish I had my daughter's best friend to defend me at that moment, because I have vivid memories of just crumbling whenever I would hear that, which was often.
But how great that your best friend up, you know, that is amazing, and that's the future, I hope.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's alarming, but also hopeful at the same time, because there was somebody else that was there to be a real ally. If only some adults could learn similar habits, right? Well, listen, I want to thank you ladies for just being so candid and opening up and giving us a much needed perspective. As you both have said, awareness, representation, these are things that greatly matter. And I would be remiss if I did not remind the audience that Lisa's show, This Is Life with Lisa Ling, premieres October 10th on CNN. Lisa, Eva, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Jamil.
Please welcome Atlantic staff writer Sophie Gilbert.
Hello, I'm about to introduce a best-selling author whose novels include Arcadia and Fates and Furies, which the latter of which a little-known bookseller called Amazon named the best book of 2015. Her new book, Matrix, is a mesmerizing trip into the 12th century, where a teenage girl who's sequestered in an abbey because of her parentage finds extraordinary ways to realize her creativity and power. I am now joined by Lauren Groff. Lauren, thank you so much for being here at the Atlantic Festival.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to speak to my favorite profile writer. Thank you.
That's very nice of you. Lauren, you were working on another book when the idea for Matrix came to you. Can you tell us how it happened and why it seemed like a project that you wanted to, or needed rather, to pursue right away?
Yes, I was working on a book called The Bastard Wilds, which I hope, knock on wood, will be out in 2023. And it's an inversion of captivity narratives, American captivity narratives, which I find amazing and weird and wonderful and very, very propagandistic, right? So it's all about sort of justifying the way that Europeans came in and just colonized the U.S. And so I was working on this thing set in 1609 when I heard this lecture. At the moment, I was at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard, which is this wonderful program where you're just you're put into a pod of other fellows, some of whom were astrophysicists, some of whom were filmmakers and sculptors and academics in different disciplines, so that ideas can spread. And it was magnificent. And so I heard this wonderful lecture by my friend Dr. Katie Bugis, who's a historian and medievalist at Notre Dame, about the liturgies of nuns. And I had almost like a waking vision as I was sitting in the audience. I saw a way to talk about the current moment while looking at the past.
Can you explain why, in wanting to speak to the current political moment, you thought a historical novel would be the right way of doing that, or what potential it might have?
Yeah, part of it was the negative capability of my own ability to actually see what was going on. I was, as you know, being a person who's online as well, everything for the Trump years felt overwhelming. It was wave after wave of just disaster, it felt like. And I didn't have an anchor. I didn't feel as though I was able to grasp the whole or see the whole with any kind of clarity. But I desperately want to talk about things that are really dark and weighing on my heart, such as climate change, right? Such as the relationship of humanity to God, and mitigated, or not mitigated, but sort of filtered through different religions, about the way that we deal with hierarchy, especially systematic hierarchies. So I saw this novel coming up, and I had this early love of the 12th century, in particular Marie de France, who's the first female poet that we know of in the French language. And Katie gave this talk, and these things came together, and I saw a way to make history and the current moment sing back and forth through time, through the air in some ways. I wanted to look back and see the roots of how we got to where we are, and I wanted the past to sort of look into the future. And it felt to me as though I had this moment, or these two moments, that were very clearly speaking to each other.
So I know that you researched the 12th century really intensively. And what were some moments that you had where you found something that was like an aha moment, or where you learned something that really surprised you, that felt like a connection?
This is a really hard question. The whole idea of writing about women in captivity in a certain way, right? Because the women at the time were kept in separate cages in certain ways. I think in the 12th, 13th century, in the medieval era, I think women only had two career paths. One was marriage and the production of children. That was the function of marriage at the time. And the other one, thank God there was this, was the church, right? And so at least there was a place for the misfits, for people who just had a horror of being married, for people who were disowned by their families, or were too strange to be married off. At least they had a place to go to. So I think the whole concept of being in a specific moment, in a specific sort of cage, it spoke to, for me, the Trump years, where I think that every time I got into the car and turned on the radio and heard that just gross oleaginous voice, I just felt oppressed, or an oppressive weight on me. And lo and behold, those years are blooming in spectacularly hideous flower now.
Yeah. You've imagined utopian communities in your work before, but Matrix is unique in that it's a female separatist society. There are no men at all over the age of 12. And I wanted to ask you how that felt to imagine. Was it liberating, challenging, provocative, all three?
Yeah. I think also, so one of the other things that went into the book too was that the day before I heard Katie Biggus's talk, I was on a plane and I saw the film The Women, which is this 1939 George Cukor film. He famously did the Philadelphia Story. And it's amazing. It's such an amazing film. The screenwriter was Anita Luce, who did the novel Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, which is one of my favorite comic novels of all times. It's so good. And the only characters are women. And they're funny, it's wisecracky, it's magnificent, except it's a product of its time. And even though the only characters on stage were women, they only talked about men, which drove me nuts. So I had this sort of, I guess, almost allergic reaction to this film that could have passed the Bechdel test, and it never did. And then the next day I heard this, and I thought, oh my gosh, I have a chance to do what so many texts of the past have done, which is relegate the female to the borders, to the edges. And there are male presences in this book. Jesus exists, right? But he's kind of a shadow along the wall, as opposed to taking any kind of center stage. There are no male characters that take center stage, and it was liberating. It felt magnificent. To only think about just the way that these women encountered one another, to concentrate conversation on the urgencies and the needs of the women around. No, this was I made a lot of jokes with all my friends that I wanted to found a lesbian separatist utopia on some Caribbean islands, and this is my only way that it could ever happen in my life.
It's so interesting, though, because the nature of power in Matrix is so fascinating to me, because Marie is a revolutionary and a dictator and altruistic and empathetic, and she saves her community, but the ways in which she wields power are not flawless. And I wanted to ask you what power means in the book, and what we can draw from that in terms of real life.
Yeah. Well, the first thing that I started thinking about when I was thinking about power is that not one of us is pure of intention or heart, even if we can justify our actions. I think everything that we do is a little bit muddled. And so when I was thinking about the nature of Marie's power in the book, and the nature of the power of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who's also a large character, generally off stage, but also a model in some ways, I wanted to look at both the way that power could be subverted, right? Both the hierarchy of the church at the time could be undermined through Marie's actions within this small abbey. It's a large abbey, but a confined space. But also the way that she's internalized the rules of power, as one does. You know, even I, who hate capitalism, have internalized the rules of capitalism, right? I am a participant actively on a daily basis in capitalism. And so it's a very tenuous place to be, to have this wobbly standpoint where you are actively working against something that you're also actively buying into. And with Marie, she couldn't not do it, right? So she had to, in some ways, enact a male hierarchy because otherwise she wasn't going to protect the nuns in the abbey. So it's both a tool and a weapon against her nuns' power. Yeah. And I don't think that it was clear to her what she was doing. She justified it to herself.
So, talking about power in a different sense, what are your intentions every day when you sit down to write, and what does writing mean to you?
Well, my intentions are to try to listen until I hear the living thing. And I know that sounds really abstract, but what I'm doing when I sit down, I'm very tired when I sit down to write. It's 5 o'clock in the morning, and I'm drinking coffee. Like, you know, I wish I could be in a coffee cup. But all I'm doing is sitting with the page and writing longhand and listening very, very hard and trying to pay very intense attention to some sort of truth that is there underneath the surface of the language, right? The language is really, really important, but not in the beginning of the writing process. So what I'm trying to do is steer urgently into an abstraction, which is very difficult to do because it's abstract, right? It's not concrete. And there's this amazing thing that I saw. The Greeks thought of words as fleeting gods. Right? I love this. I love that. It's so beautiful. But if you think about the job of the writer is to sit there and try to summon these gods for a moment and then let their power be exerted on the text and then let them, dissipate again. So so all I'm doing is just trying to summon both from without and from within. And often, most days, I fail at it. I try really hard and I can't hear the truth or I can't hear the clarity.
But clearly you can, because you've written so many books and they're so good. I can't think of another word because I'm not a writer like you. I wanted to say, you read 300 books a year, which is superhuman. I know that people who want to understand the world better often turn to nonfiction, but I wanted to ask you to make the case for fiction, for what fiction can teach people, what it can show them, what reading fiction does to a human being.
I could also make the case for nonfiction. So
sure.
Just because
Whatever.
I'm making the case for fiction doesn't mean that I don't believe in nonfiction. I do believe in nonfiction. But I think that fiction is a more oblique way of getting at what it means to be human. I think that when one reaches for nonfiction, there's a very definitive goal in mind. How to understand the cosmos, for instance, or you read about how we got into this place where we are. Fiction has a way of undermining you, even as you're following it. And I think that is the purpose of art in any genre, fiction or nonfiction, is to take the foundations on which you've built your assumptions and just shake them and try to knock you off your feet, basically, right? That is what I remember, just standing in front of my first Rothko and thinking going in that, just a couple of blobs of paint, and then weeping because I felt this underlying foundation of who I was being shaken in a way that I couldn't understand. So I think that the obliquity, right? Like the way that humanity is defined in negative space is something that fiction does extraordinarily well and is not drawn in positive space, right? So paying attention to the silences, the caesuras, the fermatas, all of the moments of silence that show us more clearly what it is to be human. That is the function of fiction to me. And that is one of the reasons why I'm never ending reading, not just fiction, but plays, but poetry, but nonfiction too, because I'm trying to delineate, I'm trying to see, right? I'm trying to see clearly, and I can't if I don't have a great deal of landscape in front of me.
I love that. That was exactly the answer I hoped you would give. It was perfect. Thank you. Lauren, it's been so wonderful talking with you today. Thank you for making the time for this. Matrix is available now, but thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Sophie. I love talking to you always.
Okay.
And that concludes day 6 of the Atlantic Festival. If you liked what you saw and you want more of The Atlantic, you can support our journalism by becoming a subscriber. Visit theatlantic.com. And if you're already a subscriber, thank you. I hope you'll tune in tomorrow beginning at 10 a.m. Eastern. Have a great evening.